O God, who were pleased to give us the shining example of the Holy Family, graciously grant that we may imitate them in practicing the virtues of family life and the bonds of charity, and so in the joy of your house, delight one day in eternal rewards. You might wonder where these words come from. They're from the collect, the opening prayer we said at the beginning of this Mass. And I bring them up because they're theologically very rich. What the prayer essentially is saying is we're asking God that we may practice the virtues of family life and deepen our love in our own homes so that one day we can enter into heaven. We can be in God's home. In other words, this prayer tells us that living family life well is a sure way to holiness. And the wise man Sirach, who wrote the first reading we heard today, says it like this: whoever honors their father atones for sins. When they pray, they will be heard. If you respect your mother, it is like you have laid up treasure. Whoever respects their father will have long life. Whoever honors their mother obeys the Lord. I think holiness is possible in family life because of the tremendous love that we are able to experience there. But also, I think we become holier through the trials and the struggles of family life too. They're kind of two sides of the same coin. And the book of Sirach, the same reading we just heard of, doesn't shy away from the struggles of family life. It actually mentions these blessings I just talked about as an encouragement for when love is not easy. But that same reading goes on to say a few more things about family life, and it talks about some of the troubles. My child, help your father in his old age. Do not grieve him as long as he lives, even if his mind fails. Be patient with him. And in our second reading, St. Paul tells us, fathers, do not provoke your children. Do not provoke your children, or they may lose heart. So family life has its share of struggles, and so did the family life of the Holy Family, Jesus, Mary, and Joseph. Sometimes we overlook that, maybe because in artwork or on Christmas cards, it always looks like the perfect Holy Family scene, right? And you think, well, maybe their life was going to be easier than our life. I mean, Jesus was the center of their home, obviously. And yet, we can create a caricature of the Holy Family because their life was not perfect. They had a lot of trials too. Just think of some of the ones around the birth of Jesus. Just think of some of these trials. Mary has to travel an incredible distance in very uncomfortable circumstances very late in her pregnancy. And when she does arrive at her destination, she gives birth in a stable. That's really the best that Joseph could do for them. Jesus is born into a poor family, right? He's not born into a wealthy family, and he's only just born when they have to pick up everything and move to Egypt. So they become refugees at a very early stage in their family life. And these are just a few of the struggles, the trials that are mentioned. And I bring these up because if the Holy Family had their share of difficulties, if God didn't exempt them, of all people, from the cross of family life, then I don't think he's going to do so with us either. Each of us will have to take up our crosses in family life. And that is because they are opportunities for growing in holiness, for growing in virtue. St. Paul said these interesting words, and I really do think that they're very interesting. You do not win the prize without competing, right? And competition means struggle. So if we're going to gain the eternal life of heaven, then we'll have to endure trials and sacrifice and difficulties in life. God does let us go through trials in family life, just as he let Joseph and Mary go through them. But it's not because he's some, really cruel, sadistic being. Rather, he will never give us more than we can handle in family life with his assistance. So I'd like to look at two things that can help us understand the value of trials in family life. Saints and spices. Yeah, I said spices. But first, let's look at spices. Trials are kind of like the spice of our spiritual life. The spices we use in cooking, well, technically speaking, they're very different than herbs, right? Herbs are the aromatic, leafy, green parts of a plant. Spices are taken from other parts of the plant, maybe bark, root, seeds, fruit, even resins, for example. Their chemical compounds are actually a defense mechanism for the plant. So in other words, the chemical that produces the spice is also the chemical that protects the plant from insects and parasites. I'll give you an example using a couple of Christmas spices, because it is the season, right? So, for instance, cinnamon is an elegant form of armor for a laurel tree, and nutmeg is a kind of toxic force field protecting the seeds of certain evergreen trees. Basically, the spice emerges from a battle for growth and survival in a hostile environment. Likewise, the virtues that give our lives meaning, that give our lives depth, are developed only through discipline and spiritual battle. What spices do for food, trials do for our spiritual life. So God allows us trials so that our lives can develop the spice of Christian holiness. And family life is the place of those trials. And I know some of you really have huge crosses to carry in your family lives, that you really do have to struggle through trials. And that is why the example of the Holy Family is so important. In their faithfulness and their love in the midst of an imperfect world, they encourage us to carry our own crosses, to endure our own trials, and they are real, in family life. Being faithful, trusting God, loving in family life, in imitation of the Holy Family, leads to holiness. And the saints are a great example and encouragement in this, because they didn't live sheltered lives. They confronted difficulties just like ours. And in having to face difficult trials, Mary and Joseph were not the exception. So they had difficulties, but all the saints had difficulties. I'm going to give you an example from some of my favorite saints. I'll just mention a few, otherwise we'll be here till breakfast tomorrow, okay? So I'm going to mention some of my favorite saints. And you'll see how all the saints have trials, but that through these trials, God brings them to greater holiness. Think of St. Patrick, for instance. He was kidnapped from his own family and sold into slavery. Think of Elizabeth of Hungary. She almost went insane when her husband died of malaria just a few years after they got married. Think of St. Padre Pio of Pietrelcina. He was criticized by his fellow monks, misunderstood by his superiors, and forbidden by the Vatican from celebrating Mass in public. Think of St. Thomas More. He was a layman and a lawyer. He was thrown out of his job by the King of England, and then he was imprisoned and interrogated and forbidden from seeing his family. And finally, when he wouldn't give up his Catholic faith, they took his head off. Think of St. Rita of Cascia. She wanted to become a nun, but her parents forced her into marriage at the tender age of 12. They married her into a wealthy businessman, but the problem was this guy was also violent and abusive. And she had to suffer his infidelities and his abuse for 18 years before he finally repented on his deathbed. What I'm trying to say is that God didn't save the saints from suffering. And in family life, we're going to have our share of trials. But the saints remind us that God works through the cross. When family life throws big or little hardships at us, It's not because God has forgotten us. It's not because God has it out for us. God permits our daily trials in family life for a purpose. They are opportunities for you and me to exercise our faith, to grow into mature, wise, and deeply joyful Christians, to move forward on the road that will lead us to heaven, that will make us saints. Family life, lived well, can lead us to our true home, heaven, God's house, a home of joy, a home of peace.